The working title is Damian's Lion. Damian stood in focused silence, listening to the trees around him. It had been 6 days since his father had dropped him in the woods, with nothing but a length of rope and a small hatchet. Damian hadn't eaten anything more than a few handfuls of wild berries that had given him the shits. That wasn't enough. As much as the idea horrified Damian, he knew he had to hunt for his next meal. And so here he was, covered in mud, moss, and deer crap Damascus scent. He'd been following a young doe for nearly 6 hours, and the sun was getting low. If he didn't get back to his cave soon, he would spend the night in the freezing cold. A twig snapped behind him, and he turned. He found himself looking into the eyes of the doe he had been chasing. She had fear in her eyes as she looked right through him. Without warning, the doe took off, sprinting through the trees. Before Damian could ready his makeshift spear, he was knocked to the ground by the full force of a charging mountain lion. Damian felt himself falling, and then the sharp sting of cold water on his face. He pushed himself up in the river and tried to back away from the carnivore, now ripping into what should have been his kill. Damian swallowed hard and began backing away, praying that the beast stayed distracted long enough for him to escape. Damian sat huddled close to his fire. He wore a makeshift blanket made out of the thick grasses he had found around his campsite. It had been little over a week since the mountain lion attack, but he was still shaken. He turned the hatchet in his hands. It was the first time he had taken the time to look at the ornately carved handle. His father used to tell him stories around the dinner table about his experience of the baptism. His father had taken his turn like his father before him, going back nearly 200 years. The baptism, a sacred rite among his tribe, required each man of 15 to spend a year in isolation. Damian was the fourth to carry this hatchet. When his father carried the tool, he had carved an egret into the handle to signify his first kill. His grandfather, an eagle. His great-grandfather, the first to carry the hatchet, carved a stag. Each baptism, a boy left, and a man returned. Damian hated the tradition. He had lost friends who weren't strong enough to survive. His eldest brother came back, mind lost and unfit to lead. Damian swore when he returned to his tribe, he would bury the hatchet into his father's brow and then burn the temple to the ground. As the fire began to fizzle out, Damian uncovered a small hole he had dug on his third night in the forest. It was just barely big enough for him to lay in, with a few of the fire stones in a compartment beneath him. The fire stones would keep his coffin-like chamber warm enough through the night. He had only to worry about the occasional snake wandering in to join him. As he closed his eyes and began to doze off, he decided that his carving would be a mountain lion. Damian awoke with a start, hearing the soft growling overhead. He clutched the hatchet close to his chest. He slowed his breathing down, remembering what he had read from Chief Ironhawk's journal. A warrior attacks while they are excited and riled up. A survivor remains level-headed and calm in any situation. He used the handle of his hatchet to push the roof of his makeshift home open slightly. Sniffing around the now extinguished fire was a small boar, little older than an infant, but still young enough to have a parent close by. Damian let the trapdoor close above him. He would not waste his energies fighting a boar and its angry mother. Boars were vicious when cornered, and he had no desire to die tonight. He placed one of his fire stones on his chest, and it was warm enough to keep him comfortable as he closed his eyes. He would deal with the boar's ransacking tomorrow morning. The sounds of birds chirping awoke Damian early the next morning, and as with every morning, he cracked the roof to ensure the coast was clear. Unlike every other morning, however, he found himself face to tail end of a mother boar. Damian quickly and silently pulled himself out of the hole. He had luckily left his important provisions at the top of a nearby tree. A twig snapped underfoot as he left the ground, earning a startled grunt from the mother boar. She turned around, bleary-eyed, and Damian froze, blending into the tree just enough that the mother boar mistook him for bark. Damian let out a silent sigh as he hoisted himself in the tree. 6 nights into his baptism, Damian had recalled what Lady Barefist had written in a letter to her youngest son. Store your provisions in the trees. The bottom feeders won't be able to get to them, and anything that can has probably already eaten you. Damian laughed to him as his hand found the makeshift ladder he had made in the branches with the rope he had been given. As he found the woven grass pad he had left there on his third trip up the tree, he flipped open a denim satchel he had repurposed from his jeans. The apple he'd been saving managed to make it through the night. He thanked all the gods that his people worshipped for that. His stomach grumbled softly as he began to cut into the apple using a sharpened stone. As he ate, his own father's voice came to him, watching the sun begin to rise over the peak of Mount Peoria. A memory of a time some 6 years before returned to the front of his mind. "A hatchet," his father had told him, "is used to kill." As Damian fumbled to hold the hatchet in his hand, his father straightened him up. "You do not use a hatchet to cut wood." His father wrapped the back of his hand with a reed. "You do not drop the hatchet." As his father, blood brother hindarm wrapped him on the wrist again, Damian let the hatchet fall to the ground. His father, in retaliation, raised the reed, bringing it across Damian's face, leaving a deep welt that went from his left cheek to his right eyebrow. Unconsciously, Damian now ran his fingers across the scar. "You never drop the hatchet," his father repeated, ringing in his ears. "If you drop your hatchet, you are dead." Damian sighed as he sat from his perch atop the tree. The apple had been eaten, but his stomach was still growling with hunger. He scanned the area around his camp for more berries or fruit, but in the 6 weeks since his arrival in the area, he had cleaned nearly every bush and tree for almost a quarter mile. He wouldn't have the energy to trek down to the river to fish. He looked down at the mother boar and her baby, still asleep by the dead fire. He gripped the hatchet in his hand, remembering his father's words. "A hatchet is used to kill," he repeated to himself. "A mountain lion, not a boar." Damian dug further into his satchel and pulled out a small length of rope he had and began to unravel it. He slid the sharpened rock against the denim, removing any leftover apple juices. He snapped a sturdy branch from a neighboring tree and began to haft his sharpened rock to it. As he finished binding the crude spear, he would have to remind himself to modify it when he had the time. He tucked the spear under his arm and slowly made his way back down the tree. "This hatchet will kill a mountain lion," he whispered to himself as his toes touched the ground on the grass, "but my spear will bring me lunch." Damian swore to himself as he awoke, back against a nearby tree, covered in blood and the greasy juices of the mother boar. The sun had already made its way down the western sky. He had slept for hours, wasting an entire day. But that boar was perfect. His first kill in the wild made for the best meal he had ever put in his mouth. He looked sadly towards the young boar he now had tied in a nearby tree. He couldn't bring himself to kill it, but he knew that releasing it was just as bad. He licked his parched lips. He needed to head down to the river. The sun had burnt his skin to a soft pink color. He had to pay for his stupidity. As he trekked through the bushes, he heard a soft growl in the distance. The mountain lion. Every instinct he had told him to run back to his camp site and tuck away in the hole. With the boar he had killed, he had enough food for at least a few days. But Damian shook his head, silencing his nerves. He pushed on through the brush and the undergrowth. There was another growl, closer this time, moving in from the west. Damian, panicked, threw himself against a nearby tree before pulling himself up into it. He knew the lion would be able to climb up to him, but if the beast didn't know his presence, he would be fine. For now. He sat in one of the middle branches, watching and waiting for the beast to make its approach. Time passed slowly for Damian. For whatever reason, the predator was taking her time coming to the river. Damian took a small chunk of the boar meat and began nibbling thoughtfully. As he ate, he found himself recalling the stories his grandfather told of his experiences in the woods. Damian, his grandfather, Running Eagle, had a voice that always comforted Damian. The woods are a dangerous place. The baptism is not just a right to manhood. It is also how the tribe weeds out those unfit for life. Damian, too young to understand at the time, laughed at his grandfather's warning. Running Eagle sighed and pat Damian's on the head. I suppose you'll be wanting a story from me, huh? Damian nodded excitedly. He loved hearing his grandfather tell tales of when he was in the woods. His grandfather was the bravest of those that had ever returned, and everybody knew that. When I was in the forest, all of the animals knew to fear me, Damian. His grandfather's face was stern, but somehow soft at the same time. They knew that to meet face to face with Mysal meant death. Who is Mysal, grandfather? Damian's small voice echoed in his mind. His grandfather gave him a hearty laugh. Boy, I was not born with the name Running Eagle. Mysal was my given name, and before I returned from the woods. On my first night in the forest, I knew I would be the king. I built myself a new home in a cave far from here. I built traps for animals to catch to eat, but none ever came. And then, 2 months into my journey, I saw her, a great golden eagle soaring overhead, Ore Tanuak, the goddess eagle. She was to be the first I killed. She would be my first meat since I left the tribe. Damian scooted closer to his grandfather. This was his favorite part of the story. Damian's memory faded fast as a low growling below him erupted into his ears. Damian sat up, clutching the spear to his chest, thanking the gods that he had thought to grab it. The mountain lion had just passed below him, making his way to the river a few hundred yards beyond his perch. Damian took a moment to cover himself with mud to help hide his scent as best he could before following. As Damian approached the river a few yards downwind of the mountain lion, the beast had his head in the water, lapping it up greedily. Damian slunk towards his prey, praying that his feet were quieter than he thought they were. A twig snapped behind Damian, and he felt his heart drop as the lion perked up. As it turned to glare in Damian's direction, he dove behind a boulder that was embedded into the earth nearby. "Shit," he whispered to himself. Now the lion would be on edge, just waiting to pounce at whatever came from his direction. As another twig snapped, a massive boar broke through the underground, squealing and screeching in what Damian could only guess as rage. The boar was much larger than the mother boar he had killed this morning, and Damian knew it was either its mate or a suitor. As the boar charged towards Damian, there was a roar as the mountain lion tackled the boar to the ground, tearing into its neck with its claws and teeth. Damian pressed himself further against the rock as the boar's lifeless body slammed into the ground in front of him. As the lion threw its head back in a triumphant roar, Damian took hold of his spear again. The lion's roar turned into a yelp of pain as Damian's spear pierced deep into its belly. The wounded creature jerked away from Damian, taking the spear with it. As the lion turned to face Damian, he felt every fiber of his being screaming to run. Damian readied himself with his hatchet, facing the lion, who panted in exhaustion and pain. Damian let out a war cry as he charged the lion. The lion growled and tried to leap at Damian, but the wound in its side sent it crashing to the ground. Damian brought the hatchet back, intent on delivering a fatal blow to the lion's throat. But as the beast took a swipe at Damian, tearing into his shirt, it left 4 deep cuts across his chest, pushing him backwards. He pulled himself up again, using the rock as leverage. The mountain lion too slouched into a standing position. The creature had a trail of blood dribbling down its chin, a mixture of its own and the boar's. Damian felt a small amount of pity for the beast before charging again. The lion's response came much slower this time, missing Damian entirely as he circled around, pulling the spear from the beast's side. As the tip of his spear left the flesh, Damian kicked out with all of his might. The mountain lion fell onto its side, growling softly as it did. Damian again felt pity, seeing this majestic beast that had turned to a puddle of blood and pain before him. He grasped the spear in his hand and pierced the animal's side again, twisting the spear as he did so. The mountain lion let out a soft, pathetic growl before resting its head in the mud. Its breathing became raspy and labored. Damian fell to his knees in front of his trophy. He brought the hatchet again above his head. The mountain lion made no move to stop him, but instead shifted its head to give Damian a clear shot at the throat. Damian, the adrenaline now leaving his system, felt tears begin to cascade down his cheeks. "This should not have been, brother," he choked as he placed a hand on the mountain lion's breast. "This was not the death you deserved." Damian brought the hatchet down on the cougar's throat, a splash of red blood hitting him in the face. The beast struggled for breath for a moment before the last breath left its body. Damian watched as the light left its eyes. "This was not the death you deserved," Damian repeated, tears streaming down his face as he pulled himself to his feet. He looked around him. What was once mud was now a mixture of blood, earth, and death. 2 corpses that hadn't need die, and Damian. Damian slunk over to the boulder and rested his head against the cold stone. His muscles screamed in pain and exhaustion. As he wiped his face, a disgusting mess of mucus, blood, mud, and tears, he remembered the rest of his grandfather's story. Damian felt a great wave of confusion as his grandfather began to weep in front of him. "Grandfather," Damian had questioned, "what is it?" Running Eagle scooped Damian up in his arms and held him close. The forest is a dangerous place, Damian, and it makes all of us do terrible things, or we die. I didn't kill Ore Tanuak for food or out of self-defense. I killed Ore Tanuak because I could, and as I watched that light leave her eyes, I was given the weight of not only her death, but the death of the clutch of babies I found at the top of the cliffs she had come from. I didn't have to kill her that day, Damian, but I wanted to. And in doing so, I killed 7 young golden eagles, barely able to open their eyes before they died of hunger. His grandfather put him back on the ground. Promise me, Damian, Running Eagle wept. Don't make the same mistakes I did. I promise, grandfather, Damian had promised. I won't. Damian gave a sad, cold chuckle as he realized he had lied. He opened his eyes suddenly, realizing now it was dark. He had fallen asleep again, and there was something biting at his leg. He pulled his leg away, rolling to one side, grabbing his spear and turning to face this new foe. There in front of him stood a pair of small, bloody mountain lion cubs, probably only a few months old. Damian fell to his knees in front of them. The realization he had followed in his grandfather's footsteps to a letter left him in pieces. The 2 cubs began to growl pathetic attempts to scare him off as they tried to nuzzle and wake up their dead mother. Their mother, Damian whispered, realizing his error. I killed their mother. A few feet away, Damian saw his hatchet glinting in the moonlight. He took it in his hand and turned to face the small felines. As he turned to face them again, splattered in their mother's blood, they began to hiss and push themselves further into their mother's corpse, trying to get away from him. Damian picked up the first of them by the scruff of his neck. As he raised the hatchet to end the small creature's lives, Running Eagle's words came to him again. I won't make the same mistake, grandfather, Damian sighed, cradling the cub in his arms. I promise. He dropped the hatchet to the ground and scooped up the other cub in his now empty arm. He turned towards the river, carrying the 2 protesting cubs with him. As he took them into the cool water, he set them both on a nearby log. He began scrubbing the caked-on blood off of his skin and hair. The entire time, the 2 cubs mewed from their perch on the log before jumping in to swim towards Damian. Damian gave the 2 kittens a soft rub-down to remove their mother's remains from them. One of the kittens began to gnaw on his fingers, not to harm, but play. Guilt swept over Damian as he realized that they had no idea he was the monster that tore their mother away from them. I'm so sorry, little ones, he whispered, carrying them back to shore, but I won't let you 2 die. He picked up his hatchet again. I won't become my father, he growled. I won't become my grandfather. He took a step towards the river, and as he screamed into the night, he hurled the hatchet out over the river. I am not my father, he yelled, and I am not my grandfather. The 2 kittens stood on the ground beside him, giving out soft roars. Damian built a small fire nearby to light the night as he worked. The kittens fell asleep, curled up in the makeshift cave of Damian's satchel. Damian began to dig into the soft earth, making a hole deep and long enough to fit the mother cougar's body. As he dug, he vowed he would never kill another animal unless it was out of desperation for food or self-defense. All of the creatures of this world were his family, and he would protect them with his life from any threat. As he finished covering up the dead mountain lion, Damian saw the flicker of a fire in a clearing across the river. His friend Philip must have just started his baptism. Damian shouldered the spear and grabbed the leg of the boar and the pouch carrying the kittens and went back to camp. Philip was no threat to Damian. He could sleep easy tonight, but he would take care of Philip in the morning.